valley, every valley shall be exalted, shall be exalted. Shall be exalted, and every mount and hill made low, the crooked straight, and the rough places plain, the crooked straight, and the rough places plain, and the rough places plain. Every valley shall be exalted, the crooked straight, and the rough places plain, and the rough places plain, and the rough places plain. The crooked straight and the rough places plain.
Well, good morning. I'm sitting here with David Abbott again for the last time this year. David's from the Penrith Symphony Orchestra. He's principal clarinet. And we're here to talk about a concert on the 1st of December, where the Penrith Symphony Orchestra and the Penrith, is it the Choral Society, are presenting Handel's Messiah.
Hi, Sebastian. Very well. How are you going?
Good, buddy. Good.
Good. Look, yes, the concert, I was just going to get the correct title there so that the choir aren't unhappy with us. We're doing a co-production with Penrith City Choir, and that's on the 1st at 3 o'clock, so Sunday week, I believe. So, yes.
Yes, absolutely. And the music is The Messiah by Georg Friedrich Handel, who was a German who moved to work in the, well, he didn't work in the court, but he certainly worked in London under King George II.
He did. It's interesting because Handel, we think of often as a very English composer, but yes, he was German born, but he spent the majority of his working life in London and the UK, and obviously he did tour around and do stuff, but he moved over to London in 1712 and became established there. And I guess, that initial phase of his career, he's very famous for bringing Italian opera to Britain, and something like 40 operas, I believe. So that's where he sort of started out life.
Yes, and quite celebrated and pretty much, I'm looking for the word, an overnight sensation when he arrived. He seems to have been successful pretty much straight away.
Yeah, I think it continued to develop, but even in those earlier years, you go back to the mid sort of 1720s, and listeners would be, in terms of in the modern day, probably the other really famous work that he's known for is Zadok the Priest, which has been used, at every coronation in Britain since it was composed. So stuff like that, music for the Royal Fireworks, and of course the work we're here to talk about today, Messiah.
So what's the story of the Messiah?
Well, it's quite interesting because I was just mentioning there the idea that he was famous for, Italian opera. But I suppose the backstory is that the popularity of that form started to wane from about the mid-1730s. And so he'd continued writing them, but there are a few combination of things. Like the popularity certainly was in decline, but there were other competitive sort of rival opera companies that had been set up as well. So Handel, I think, ran, I don't think consecutively, but had run something like 3 different opera companies. And so there was more competition, less demand. And so I think, like everyone and musicians to this day, Handel had to be pragmatic about thinking, well, how do I pay my bills? And so I think he might have sensed that the oratorio might have sort of some options there. And there are a few other things with the form. One of the things that was a hangover from the previous century, the church had sort of implemented bans during Lent on performance of, spectacles, or I suppose, entertainments. And so oratorio, unlike opera, tend to deal with sacred subjects, or that's kind of the change in definition. There's a few other things with how opera is far more staged and in props and costumes and all the rest of it. But the essential difference is that, generally speaking, oratorio deal with a secular, like a sacred subject rather than the secular. And so this was a way of circumventing that problem, that they could put these works on in the theatre when, they perhaps weren't supposed to, or in some cases weren't allowed to have other spectacle like opera and light entertainment. So sorry, you continue there.
Yeah, no, it's one commentary I read, and I know several commentators at the time were absolutely scandalised that sacred work would be presented within the context of a secular theatre.
Yeah, I think we might come back to that one, and it's that ties in with the emergence of the work and how it was received. But certainly, and so I guess the point there, coming back to why he's writing in that style, it was a way of being expedient and being able to present works that were going to be able to be performed, and perhaps we're trying to get around this problem of the decline in popularity of opera. So that brings us to this period of, as I say, the late 1730s and then through the 1740s. So that's the point at which the work was conceived. In terms of the writing, I mean, a lot of people talk about the speed with which it was written, but you kind of have to remember that there's a bit of a fallacy that says that, he wrote it in a burst of sort of religious fervour. But in fact, most of the writing, and there are other, like the example is that when he finished writing the music for Messiah, he commenced writing Saul and Belshazzar, something like 2 or 3 weeks later. He's straight back into it. And he completed the overall thing in only like 24 days. But as I said, that wasn't unusual at the time. And so Bach would be able to write the sort of similar length work when you're not presenting other stuff. I think they're getting in the off season and writing. So he's produced this work. And I guess we'll talk a little bit more about its premiere and so forth. But do you want to say anything about the librettist or anything like that? Or?
Oh, sure, yeah, please. Any information is good information.
So the collaborator on the work, the text is by a guy called Charles Jennens, and he was quite an interesting guy because he, he's a wealthy landowner. He'd inherited a lot of money, but he was quite the intellectual, and he was very devoutly religious. And I think probably what we'd call him today, but he was sort of considered something of a mystic and a bit of a literalist. And it's interesting in that time period because, this is the birth of the scientific age and sort of the rationalist. And I think, he might have been viewed, he was somewhat of an oddity at that time in that way. But that actually imbues the text with a more sort of philosophical approach, that like it's not a linear sort of narrative text. And I think that has sort of far-reaching effects with the appeal of the work, because you don't necessarily have to be religious or Christian or, you know, of any of those denominations to sort of appreciate the scope of the work or what it perhaps says from a, as I say, a philosophical or an intellectual perspective.
Absolutely, yeah. It's yeah. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
Oh no, that was just to set it up a bit. And so
okay.
this is their librettist, and Handel then, you know, set about putting it to music.
Now, I think some of the commentary I read, and you've talked about it a bit already, is that when he wrote it, he would have written the themes, he would have written the tunes, but particularly in the Baroque, there was a kind of an assumption that you would have some sort of continuo underneath, and that things like the ornamentation would have been understood within a limited number of ornaments per phrase of music, and types of ornaments and that sort of thing. So when we think of writing a score, if you look at, say, the work of I'm just trying to think. I saw one of Tchaikovsky's drafts on the internet once, and you know, there's just line after line after line. My impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that in the Baroque this wasn't necessarily the case.
No, up until, so sort of a little bit of context to that, and because you mentioned Tchaikovsky, it takes quite a while, even into the 19th century, to get music that is, even from in an autograph score, for example, that it's more like what we envisage as scores that we might look at today, and scores that we obviously, you know, that you now would go out and buy or purchase have been edited and, you know, typeset and so on. And so there's a lot of the expressive marking, so, and the detail that I suppose you're talking about there has been added later. But in terms of composers, they became, I suppose, more specific and more setting things more concretely as you move forward. Even at the time of Mozart and Haydn, it was far more usual, like the Baroque, to have the score with, you know, the notes are all there, but there's a lot that's left. I wouldn't say it's left up to the performer, but rather that it's the idea that the performer and the musician was expected to have an understanding of the performance practice of the time and musicianship. So in that way, when you talk about works like Messiah, yes, you've got the orchestra parts there with the strings, and but underneath that, you also have what we talk about and call a continuo line, which is usually played by the harpsichord in that context. But that writing, I mean, they'll have a score, but they'll have what we would know as a figured bass. And actually, for a modern listener, that has a lot more in common with a score or a part with guitar tabs on it, or, you know, just chords marked down, so that the player was expected to, you know, flesh that out, embellish it, and indeed improvise the harmony part. So it actually is incredibly similar to listening to a pianist in a jazz setting. In fact, even in a big band, it really is the same idea, and they've got the same kind of license to flesh out the music like that. So so that's something of the performance practice of the time there as well.
Yeah. So it was premiered in Dublin.
That's right. So he finished writing it in 1741, and the first performances occurred in Dublin. Now, allegedly, this was going to be so popular that sounds really quaint, but there was a request for ladies not to wear their hoops in their dresses so that they could get more people into the hall, apparently. So that was very well received. But I think there must have been misgivings about how popular the work was going to be in London, because it wasn't until a year later that the work premiered there. So this is 1743, and it really didn't actually get the reception that it had had the previous year. I think audiences, it's a little bit hard to judge from the modern age exactly why that was, but perhaps we've just touched upon it there. I think they might have considered it maybe blasphemous with the religious text in the theatre, but it could also be that the text itself in the libretto, and as I mentioned previously, it's not a linear narrative. So it's much more, and I think the librettist Jennens actually describes it as a contemplation on Christ, on the religiosity and all of that. It's not so you don't have a story that's told that unfolds with people, with singers or chorus, depicting characters. There's one or two movements where there's some direct action described, but the rest of it is much more philosophical and abstract in terms of how it works. So that might have had something to do with it, because audiences would have an expectation of the style that they're going to get, and then when you go along and it's completely different, they kind of walk away going, oh, I don't know, what was that? So yeah, I think that might explain that to some extent.
I'm sitting here with David Abbott. He's the principal clarinet player with the Penrith Symphony Orchestra, and we're discussing the upcoming concert on the 1st of December of the performance of the Messiah that's going to happen at the Jane Performing Arts Centre in Penrith. So David, it got premiered, it went to England, and then over the centuries, it's really become quite a feature. It's really become, it's gone through some transformations, hasn't it?
Yes, yeah, and so we were just saying before there that it didn't get received well in London at that time. It wasn't really until about 1750 when Handel instituted a series of, and I think it happened annually, the work would be performed at the London Foundling Hospital, and you know, the work seems to have sort of taken on a life of its own from that point, and was really, that's where it really became popularised and kind of in the repertoire. But the interesting thing is that as we move forward, there's then been further arrangements and expansions of the work. And this is where modern audiences are probably more familiar with the idea of Messiah. And that is these performances with absolutely, in some cases, you know, huge forces. So you could have choirs of thousands, and then obviously you'd have to have an ensemble underneath that to support that. So massive forces. And that was really kind of a 19th century thing. And then that kind of changed again because we come into the 20th century. And I suppose from sort of the mid 20th century, there's been more generally in music, a recognition of the importance of kind of referencing performance practice of the day. And as we said before, I mean, the first premiere of the work, you're probably looking at an orchestra of, you know, 20 something players, and the choir may well have been about the same size. So I guess the important thing when we're talking about what that means is that whilst, you know, those huge forces create this, as I say, this grand spectacle, and that's exciting in that way, I think sometimes it takes away from the directness and the intimacy of the work, and particularly when you've got a work that is kind of, as I say, philosophical and contemplative. You know, there's that immediacy of having the smaller ensemble to do it. So it's kind of had this sort of full circle of how it's sort of been played and how it's been perceived in that way.
So our concert in Penrith, we have. Why do I keep forgetting this choir's name, David?
I don't know. So look, they're very famous in the area. No, it's Penrith City Choir.
Penrith City
and
Choir. Thank you.
Yeah, and so they're performing the role of the chorus.
Yeah.
And you know, and it's very exciting to do that because we do the Messiah biennially, and we do other concerts obviously with the choir. But I think this is one that's recognised locally as, you know, the big event. So it's good that that's come around again. And we've also got 4 soloists obviously there. They're wonderful. Two of them. So we have Camilla Wright as a soprano. Agnes Sarkis is playing the alto role. Michael Bouchard is the tenor, and Richard Anderson the bass. Agnes and Richard are actually both principal artists with Opera Australia, and you know, they're all well established around doing various opera performances on the concert stage and, you know, staged opera. So it's great to have those guys along too.
It sounds like it's going to be a terrific afternoon. It's certainly one of the traditional works.
It is, and look, I think just cutting into sort of sum it all up, we've talked a lot about the idea that Messiah is this Christmas event and a tradition, but if you're wanting to come to a concert to sort of, it's a bit different to the other concerts that PSO does, but I think the thing that strikes me actually is that the music and the word painting and the colour of the work is exciting. But I mean, having the choir there, as I said, creates, you know, it's a great atmosphere in the hall. And just on that too, it is well loved. I know we always say this in a promotional sense, but I think the tickets are going very quickly. So if you do want to come, I'd suggest getting on and having a look at what's there.
Absolutely. I mean, almost everybody will know, if not all, well, probably not all, but will know a lot of the tunes. It's instantly recognisable.
Yeah, I mean, look, the obviously the most famous one there is the Hallelujah chorus, but there are many other moments from the very opening and all the way through. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and as you say, there's exquisite moments of intimacy in it as well.
Yeah, Handel's very kind of restrained in how he uses all of the forces. You know, it's not. I think a lot of those works can come across as being a bit monolithic, but you know, he's very sort of sparing and very calculated in how he uses the various instruments in the orchestra and how he balances the use of the chorus with the soloists and all of those things.
Yeah. Excellent, mate. Thank you very much. We will see you there.
Yeah. Thanks again, Sebastian. It's been good to have a chat about the concert.
Yeah. Best for the upcoming silly season, and let's hope 2025 is a bottler for everybody.
Absolutely, and the same to you, and Merry Christmas to everyone.
Thank you. I'm just going to play out. I've got a recording of Voices 8, who are one of my favourite groups ever, with the Academy of Ancient Music with Christopher Hogwood playing. And we've got excerpts from the Messiah. So see you after the break.
Son is